You all heard what she said. How could—
You're nothing but a worthless parasite who married above her station. The words sliced through the elegant dining room of the Riverside Country Club like a blade through silk, but it was what came next that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Marcus Whitfield, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune and respected member of Chicago's elite society, leaned across the pristine white tablecloth and spat directly into his wife's face, the saliva landing on her dark cheek as she sat frozen in shock among their closest friends and business associates. The crystal glasses stopped clinking. The gentle murmur of conversation died instantly. Even the soft jazz music from the corner seemed to fade as 30 of the city's most influential people watched in horrified silence as Zara Whitfield, brilliant, composed, dignified Zara, slowly reached for her napkin with trembling hands, her dark eyes never leaving her husband's face as she wiped away his contempt along with what remained of her public dignity. "That's what you deserve," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the stunned room with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. "A ghetto rat who thinks she belongs at the table with real people. Look around, Zara. Look at these faces. They all know what I know. You're an embarrassment to the Whitfield name, and everyone here is wondering why I haven't divorced you already." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of silverware as guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the spectacle unfolding before them and their own plates, desperate to be anywhere else but witnessing this moment of pure, calculated humiliation. But what none of them knew, what Marcus himself had never bothered to discover, was that the woman he had just degraded in front of Chicago's elite owned 93% of Whitfield Pharmaceuticals, the very company that had made his family fortune possible, and that his public cruelty had just signed his own professional death warrant. Zara Whitfield sat perfectly still, her spine straight despite the weight of 30 pairs of eyes boring into her, her hands folded in her lap as she processed not just the physical assault, but the deeper betrayal of being reduced to nothing more than a racial stereotype in front of people she had considered friends. The woman who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, who had built a biotech empire from her dorm room, who had quietly saved Marcus's family company from bankruptcy 3 years ago, was being dismissed as worthless by a man who had never earned a single dollar of his own wealth. If you believe in the power of justice and the strength that comes from being underestimated, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see that dignity can never truly be stolen, and subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that remind us that the quietest people often carry the loudest thunder. The aftermath of Marcus's public assault rippled through the dining room like poison spreading through clear water. Zara remained seated, her composure intact despite the tremor in her hands that only she could feel. Around her, the carefully constructed world of Chicago's pharmaceutical elite struggled to process what they had witnessed. Not just the shocking cruelty, but their own complicity in allowing it to happen. Dr. Helena Whitfield, Marcus's mother and the supposed matriarch of the family, was the first to break the silence. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that matched the coldness in her pale blue eyes as she dabbed her lips with her napkin and spoke with the measured tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "Well," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume for the entire table to hear, "I suppose we all knew this day would come. Some people simply cannot rise to meet the standards of the families they marry into." The words hit Zara like a second slap, but she had learned long ago that Helena's cruelty was as predictable as it was precise. The woman who had spent 40 years building her reputation as one of the country's leading pharmaceutical researchers had never forgiven her son for marrying beneath what she considered his station, and she had made Zara's life a careful study in psychological warfare disguised as maternal concern. "Mother's right," chimed in Victoria Whitfield Sterling, Marcus's younger sister, her voice carrying the particular brand of venom that only family members could perfect. Victoria had inherited her mother's sharp features and her father's sense of entitlement, but none of their intelligence, compensating for her mediocrity with a talent for cruelty that she wielded like a surgical instrument. "Zara's always been different. We've all tried to help her fit in, but some people just don't have the breeding for this kind of life." Zara felt the familiar sting of their coordinated attack, the way they had perfected the art of making her feel like an intruder in her own marriage. But it was the reaction of her supposed best friend that cut deepest of all. Sophia Chen, the woman who had been Zara's roommate at Harvard, her maid of honor, her confidant through every triumph and heartbreak, sat just 3 seats away with her eyes carefully fixed on her wine glass, her silence more damning than any words could have been. "Sophia," Zara said quietly, her voice barely audible above the uncomfortable shifting of chairs and clearing of throats. "You're awfully quiet tonight." Sophia looked up then, and for just a moment Zara saw something flicker across her friend's face. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition of the line they were all crossing. But then Sophia's expression hardened, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of a friendship being sacrificed on the altar of social acceptance. "I think," Sophia said carefully, her voice gaining strength as she committed to her betrayal, "that maybe Marcus has a point. You've always been intense, Zara. Driven in ways that make people uncomfortable. Maybe it's time to consider whether you're really happy in this world, or if you're just trying to prove something that doesn't need proving." The betrayal was surgical in its precision, delivered with the kind of intimate knowledge that only a best friend could possess. Sophia knew exactly which words would cut deepest, which insecurities to target, which dreams to dismiss. She had been there when Zara had cried about feeling like an outsider, when she had questioned whether she belonged in Marcus's world, when she had wondered if love was enough to bridge the gap between their different backgrounds. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile spreading across his face as he watched his wife absorb the coordinated assault from every direction. "You see, darling? Even your closest friend can see what I've been trying to tell you for years. You're fighting a battle you can never win because you're fighting against nature itself. Some people are born to lead and others," he gestured dismissively in her direction, "others are born to follow, or in your case, to be grateful for the opportunities they're given." The conversation around the table began to resume in fits and starts, as if the other guests were testing whether it was safe to pretend normalcy could be restored. But Zara could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way people were already beginning to distance themselves from her, to treat her as if Marcus's public humiliation had revealed some fundamental truth about her character rather than his own. Dr. James Morrison, Marcus's business partner and the co-founder of their latest pharmaceutical venture, cleared his throat and raised his glass with the kind of forced joviality that suggested he was eager to move past the uncomfortable scene. "Well," he said, his voice booming across the table, "perhaps we should focus on more pleasant topics. Marcus, why don't you tell everyone about the new acquisition? I know you've been working on something that could revolutionize the industry." Marcus's chest swelled with pride as he launched into a detailed explanation of his plans to acquire Biogenesis Labs, a cutting-edge research facility that specialized in gene therapy treatments. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own brilliance, describing complex scientific processes with the casual authority of a man who believed his Harvard MBA made him an expert in everything. "The acquisition will cost us nearly $2 billion, Marcus explained, his voice growing more animated as he warmed to his subject. "But the potential returns are astronomical. We're talking about treatments that could cure genetic diseases, extend human lifespan, revolutionize medicine as we know it. This is the kind of visionary thinking that separates real leaders from followers." Zara listened to her husband's presentation with the kind of focused attention that had made her one of the youngest biotech entrepreneurs in the country, noting the gaps in his understanding, the oversimplifications in his analysis, the fundamental misunderstanding of the science behind the treatments he was so eager to monetize. But she said nothing, her silence interpreted by everyone at the table as evidence of her inability to contribute to such sophisticated discussions. What they didn't know, what Marcus himself had never bothered to learn, was that Zara had been quietly building her own pharmaceutical empire for the past 8 years, using her maiden name and a network of shell companies to hide her involvement from a husband who would have seen her success as a threat to his own ego. The Biogenesis Labs that Marcus was so eager to acquire? Zara had been their primary investor for 3 years, holding a controlling interest in the company through her investment firm, Genesis Capital. As Marcus continued his presentation, describing his plans to streamline operations and maximize efficiency at Biogenesis, Zara felt a cold fury building in her chest. He was talking about dismantling everything she had helped build, about turning a research facility dedicated to saving lives into nothing more than a profit center designed to enrich the Whitfield family fortune. "The beauty of this acquisition," Marcus was saying, his voice filled with the kind of arrogance that had always made Zara's skin crawl, is that we'll be able to cut costs immediately. All this touchy-feely research into rare diseases and orphan drugs, that's not where the money is. We'll focus on treatments for common conditions, things that affect millions of people. That's how you build a real pharmaceutical empire. Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly, his own greed evident in the way his eyes lit up at the mention of profit margins. Brilliant strategy, Marcus. Sometimes you have to make hard choices to achieve greatness. Not everyone has the vision to see the bigger picture. Zara's hands tightened in her lap as she listened to them discuss the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The casual dismissal of research that could save thousands of lives. The reduction of human suffering to nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet. But still, she said nothing, her silence mistaken for ignorance rather than the careful calculation of someone who was already 3 moves ahead in a game her opponents didn't even know they were playing. As the evening wore on and the conversation shifted to other topics, Zara found herself studying the faces around the table with new eyes. These people who had witnessed her humiliation, who had participated in her degradation, who had chosen Marcus's cruelty over basic human decency. They were about to learn that their comfortable world was built on foundations far more fragile than they had ever imagined. The drive home from the country club passed in suffocating silence, the leather interior of Marcus's Bentley feeling more like a tomb than a luxury vehicle. Zara stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, its glittering lights blurring through tears she refused to let fall, while Marcus hummed contentedly to himself as if he had just enjoyed a pleasant evening among friends rather than orchestrating his wife's public destruction. "You know," Marcus said finally, his voice casual as he navigated the empty streets toward their Lincoln Park mansion. "Tonight went better than I expected. I was worried you might make a scene, but you handled it with surprising grace. Maybe there's hope for you yet." The condescension in his tone was so complete, so utterly devoid of self-awareness, that Zara almost laughed. Here was a man who had just committed assault in front of 30 witnesses, who had reduced his wife to a racial stereotype for the entertainment of his social circle, and he was congratulating her for not fighting back. The disconnect between his perception and reality was so vast that it would have been comical if it weren't so devastating. "I'm proud of you for finally accepting your place," Marcus continued, pulling into their circular driveway past the fountain that Zara had paid for, but that bore the Whitfield family crest. "It takes wisdom to recognize when you're outmatched, when you're in a world that's simply beyond your capabilities. Tonight showed everyone that you understand your role in this family." Zara stepped out of the car without responding, her heels clicking against the marble steps as she climbed toward the front door of the house that had never felt like home. The Georgian mansion with its perfectly manicured gardens and imposing columns was everything Marcus had wanted in a family estate. A monument to wealth and status that announced the Whitfield family's importance to anyone who passed by. But for Zara, it had always felt like a beautiful prison, a place where she was expected to play the role of grateful wife while slowly suffocating under the weight of other people's expectations. Inside, the house was dark except for the soft glow of accent lighting that illuminated the oil paintings of Marcus's ancestors, generations of Whitfield men who stared down from their gilded frames with the same expression of entitled superiority that their descendant wore so naturally. Zara climbed the grand staircase toward her private study, a room that Marcus rarely entered because he found her little hobbies boring and irrelevant to the serious business of maintaining the family's social position. But Zara's study was far from a hobby room. Behind the locked door and beneath the carefully maintained facade of a wealthy wife's personal retreat lay the nerve center of an empire that dwarfed anything the Whitfield family had ever built. The walls were lined with monitors displaying real-time financial data from markets around the world, and the custom-built computer system hummed quietly as it processed millions of data points related to pharmaceutical research, biotech investments, and genetic therapy developments. Zara settled into her chair and entered the complex series of passwords that protected her most sensitive files, watching as her screens came alive with information that would have shocked anyone who thought they knew her. Genesis Capital, the investment firm she had built from nothing, now controlled assets worth over $15 billion. Her portfolio included stakes in 47 pharmaceutical companies, 12 biotech startups, and 3 major research universities. She held patents on 17 different genetic therapy treatments, owned controlling interests in 4 FDA-approved drug manufacturing facilities, and had quietly become one of the most influential figures in the global pharmaceutical industry. The irony was exquisite in its completeness. While Marcus spent his days playing the role of pharmaceutical executive, attending meetings where he contributed little beyond his family name and inherited connections, Zara was actually building the future of medicine. The treatments he dismissed as unprofitable orphan drugs were generating hundreds of millions in revenue through her companies. The research he considered wasteful was producing breakthrough therapies that were revolutionizing treatment for genetic diseases. The vision he lacked was being realized through her investments, her partnerships, her relentless focus on using science to save lives rather than simply generate profits. But perhaps the most delicious irony of all was the secret that Marcus had never discovered despite 3 years of marriage. Zara owned 93% of Whitfield Pharmaceuticals itself. When the company had faced bankruptcy 5 years ago, drowning in debt from failed drug trials and regulatory setbacks, it had been Zara's money that saved it. She had purchased the company's debt through a series of shell corporations, then converted that debt into equity when the Whitfield family had no other options. Marcus believed his brilliant leadership had turned the company around, never realizing that his wife had been pulling the strings all along. The acquisition of Biogenesis Labs that Marcus was so excited about? It would never happen, because Zara controlled both companies and had no intention of allowing her husband to destroy years of careful research in pursuit of short-term profits. The visionary strategy he had outlined at dinner would die in the boardroom when the financing mysteriously fell through, when regulatory approvals were delayed, when key personnel suddenly became unavailable. Marcus would blame market forces and bad luck, never suspecting that his own wife was the invisible hand guiding his failures. Zara pulled up the files related to tonight's dinner party, cross-referencing the guest list with her extensive database of pharmaceutical industry connections. Dr. Morrison's research grant applications, which had been pending approval for months, would be quietly rejected. Victoria's husband's medical device company would find their FDA submissions delayed indefinitely. Helena's consulting contracts with 3 major pharmaceutical companies would mysteriously fail to be renewed. Even Sophia's biotech startup, which had been struggling to secure Series B funding, would discover that every potential investor had suddenly lost interest. The beauty of Zara's position was that none of them would ever connect their professional setbacks to their personal cruelty. They would assume they were victims of market forces, regulatory changes, or simple bad luck. They would never suspect that the woman they had dismissed as powerless was systematically dismantling their careers with the same precision that Marcus had used to destroy her dignity. But Zara's revenge would extend far beyond professional consequences. She had spent 3 years documenting every instance of Marcus's infidelity, every financial irregularity in his business dealings, every tax evasion scheme that the Whitfield family had used to protect their wealth. She had recordings of Helena's racist comments at family gatherings, evidence of Victoria's embezzlement from the family foundation, proof of Dr. Morrison's falsification of clinical trial data. When the time came to destroy them completely, she would have enough ammunition to ensure that their fall from grace was as public and humiliating as her own had been tonight. The soft chime of her secure phone interrupted her planning, and Zara smiled as she saw the caller ID. David Chen, Sophia's younger brother, and one of the few people who knew the truth about Zara's business empire, was calling from his office in Hong Kong where he served as her primary liaison with Asian pharmaceutical markets. "I saw the news alerts," David said without preamble, his voice tight with anger. "Sophia was at that dinner tonight, wasn't she? Please tell me she didn't participate in whatever happened." Zara's smile faded as she remembered her best friend's betrayal, the way Sophia had chosen social acceptance over loyalty, the careful precision with which she had delivered her verbal assault. "She participated," Zara said quietly. "She chose her side." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before David spoke again, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I'm sorry, Zara. I know how much her friendship meant to you. But you know what this means, don't you? The Chun family's pharmaceutical holdings, our research partnerships, our distribution networks. They're all at your disposal now. Sophia made her choice, and now she'll live with the consequences." Zara felt a moment of sadness for the friendship that had died tonight, for the woman who had once been closer to her than a sister, but who had chosen to sacrifice their bond for the approval of people who would never truly accept her. But the sadness was quickly replaced by cold determination. Sophia had made her choice, and now Zara would make hers. "Initiate Protocol 7, Zara said, using the code phrase that would begin the systematic destruction of everyone who had participated in her humiliation. "It's time for the Whitfield family to learn what real power looks like." As she ended the call and began implementing the first phase of her plan, Zara felt a sense of calm settle over her for the first time in years. Tonight had been the end of her old life, the death of the woman who had tried to find acceptance in a world that would never welcome her. But it was also the beginning of something new, the rise of someone who would no longer hide her strength, who would no longer pretend to be less than she was, who would show the world that the most dangerous enemies were the ones you never saw coming. The first domino fell exactly 72 hours after the dinner party, though Marcus Whitfield was too intoxicated by his own sense of triumph to recognize the sound of his world beginning to collapse. He sat in his corner office at Whitfield Pharmaceuticals, feet propped up on the mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather, scrolling through congratulatory messages from colleagues who had witnessed his masterful handling of his wife's public humiliation. The knock on his door interrupted his self-congratulation, and his assistant Jennifer entered with an expression that immediately set off alarm bells in Marcus's mind. Jennifer had worked for the Whitfield family for 15 years, and in all that time, he had never seen her look quite so pale, quite so shaken, quite so reluctant to deliver whatever news she carried. "Mr. Whitfield," she began, her voice carefully controlled, "I've just received a call from First National Bank. They're requesting an immediate meeting regarding the biogenesis acquisition financing. Apparently, there's been some kind of complication." Marcus's feet hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the spacious office. What kind of complication? The financing was approved weeks ago. The contracts are already drawn up. We're supposed to close next Friday. Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she consulted her notes. "According to Mr. Patterson at the bank, there's been a sudden change in Biogenesis's ownership structure. Apparently, a majority stakeholder has emerged who wasn't previously disclosed in the due diligence process. The bank is concerned about potential conflicts of interest and wants to suspend the acquisition pending a full investigation." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but before he could fully process their implications, his phone began ringing with the urgent tone reserved for emergency calls. Dr. Morrison's name flashed on the screen, and Marcus grabbed the receiver with hands that had begun to shake despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Marcus, thank God." Morrison's voice was tight with panic. "Have you heard about the FDA investigation? They're freezing all of our current drug trials pending a review of our clinical data. They're saying there are irregularities in our testing protocols, questions about patient safety. This could destroy us." Marcus felt the room begin to spin as the magnitude of what was happening started to sink in. Two catastrophic setbacks in the span of minutes, both targeting the core of his business empire, both appearing out of nowhere like guided missiles aimed at his family's legacy. "That's impossible," he managed to say, though his voice lacked conviction. "Our protocols are bulletproof. We've never had a single FDA violation." "That's what I thought too," Morrison replied, his voice cracking with stress. "But they have documentation, Marcus. Internal memos, email chains, recorded conversations. Someone has been feeding them information from inside our organization. Someone with access to everything." The call ended abruptly, leaving Marcus staring at the phone in his hand as if it were a foreign object. Around him, the office that had always felt like a throne room suddenly seemed smaller, more fragile, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He tried to call his mother, then Victoria, then his father's old business partners, but each conversation brought worse news. Helena's consulting contracts had been terminated without explanation. Victoria's husband's medical device company was facing a federal investigation for safety violations. The Whitfield family's carefully constructed network of influence and protection was disintegrating in real time. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the building's executive parking garage, Zara sat in her Tesla watching the chaos unfold through the security cameras she had quietly installed throughout the building months earlier. Her tablet displayed a dozen different feeds showing Marcus pacing frantically in his office, Helena screaming at her assistant over the phone, Victoria crying in the ladies' room as she tried to reach her husband's lawyer. The sight should have brought Zara satisfaction, but instead she felt only a cold, clinical detachment, like a surgeon observing the success of a particularly complex operation. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Chun. Phase 1 complete. Morrison's research data has been leaked to 3 major pharmaceutical journals. The falsification evidence will be front-page news by tomorrow morning. Are you ready for Phase 2? Zara typed back quickly. Initiate Phase 2. It's time for the family meeting. The Whitfield family emergency meeting was called for that evening at Helena's Beacon Hill mansion, the imposing Victorian structure that had served as the family's seat of power for 3 generations. Zara arrived precisely on time, her black dress simple but elegant, her demeanor calm despite the storm of accusations and recriminations that had been swirling around her all day. Marcus had spent the afternoon convinced that somehow, impossibly, his wife was connected to their sudden run of catastrophic bad luck, though he couldn't articulate how someone he considered powerless could orchestrate such sophisticated attacks. The family gathered in Helena's study, a room lined with medical textbooks and pharmaceutical industry awards that testified to decades of professional achievement. Helena sat behind her massive desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict, while Marcus paced frantically and Victoria huddled in a corner chair, her usual arrogance replaced by genuine fear. The atmosphere was thick with desperation and barely controlled panic. "This is all connected," Marcus announced without preamble, his voice hoarse from hours of frantic phone calls. "The FDA investigation, the financing problems, the contract cancellations. Someone is orchestrating this. Someone with inside knowledge and serious resources." Helena's pale eyes fixed on Zara with laser-like intensity. "And who do you think might have both the motive and the means to attack our family so systematically?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and Zara felt the familiar weight of their collective suspicion settling on her shoulders. But this time, instead of shrinking under their scrutiny, she felt a surge of power that was almost intoxicating. They suspected her, but they had no idea of the true scope of what she was capable of, no understanding of the empire she had built while they dismissed her as irrelevant. "Are you suggesting," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying a new edge that made everyone in the room pause, "that I somehow have the power to manipulate federal agencies, international banks, and pharmaceutical companies? That seems like quite an impressive skill set for someone you've always considered worthless." Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes wild with a combination of fear and rage. "Don't play innocent with me, Zara. This started right after the dinner party. Right after you were publicly exposed for what you really are. Maybe you decided to lash out, to try to hurt us the only way you could." "And how exactly would I do that?" Zara asked, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "What resources do I have? What connections? What power? According to all of you, I'm nothing but a parasite who married above her station. So please, explain to me how someone so powerless could bring down the mighty Whitfield family." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and for the first time since she had known them, Zara saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. They had spent so many years dismissing her, diminishing her, reducing her to nothing more than an unwelcome addition to their family tree, that they had never bothered to actually investigate who she really was or what she was capable of. Victoria spoke up from her corner, her voice shrill with hysteria. "Maybe she hired someone. Maybe she's been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to destroy us. Maybe everything about her has been a lie from the beginning." Zara smiled then, an expression so cold and calculating that it sent chills through everyone present. "You're absolutely right, Victoria. Everything has been a lie, but not the lie you think." She walked to Helena's desk and placed a thick folder on its polished surface, the sound echoing through the silent room like a gunshot. "The lie isn't that I've been plotting against you. The lie is that you ever had any power to begin with." Helena opened the folder with trembling hands, her face growing paler with each document she examined. Stock certificates, ownership papers, financial statements, board resolutions, page after page of evidence that the Whitfield Pharmaceutical empire belonged not to the Whitfield family, but to the woman they had spent years treating as an unwelcome guest in their own home. 93%, Zara said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. I own 93% of Whitfield Pharmaceuticals. I own the patents on your most profitable drugs. I own the manufacturing facilities, the distribution networks, the research laboratories. I own everything you thought was yours. Marcus collapsed into a chair as if his legs had given out, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension. That's impossible. The company has been in our family for generations. My grandfather built it from nothing. Your grandfather built a small chemical company that went bankrupt in 1987. Zara corrected, her voice clinical in its precision. I bought the assets, the name, and the legacy through a series of shell companies. Everything you think you inherited, I gave you. Every success you've celebrated, I made possible. Every dollar you've spent, I earned. Helena's hands shook as she continued reading, her medical training allowing her to understand the complex financial structures that had hidden Zara's ownership for years. The research grants, the FDA approvals, the international partnerships, you controlled all of it. I controlled all of it, Zara confirmed, and now I'm taking it back. The room erupted in chaos as the full implications of her revelation sank in. Marcus lunged toward her, his face twisted with rage, but stopped short when he saw the expression in her eyes. Not fear, but a cold calculation that promised consequences he couldn't imagine. Victoria began sobbing hysterically, her world of privilege and entitlement crumbling around her. Helena sat frozen behind her desk, her brilliant mind struggling to process the magnitude of her miscalculation. You can't do this, Marcus whispered, his voice broken. The family name, the legacy, the employees who depend on us. You'll destroy everything. I'll destroy everything you built on lies and cruelty, Zara corrected. But I'll save everything that actually matters, the research, the treatments, the lives that can be saved by real medicine instead of profit-driven schemes. The Whitfield name will disappear, but the work will continue under new leadership. Better leadership. As she walked toward the door, Zara paused and turned back to face the family that had never accepted her, never valued her, never imagined that she could be anything more than what they allowed her to be. You wanted to know your place in this world, she said, echoing Marcus's words from the dinner party. Now you do. You have no place at all. 6 months later, the boardroom of what was now Genesis Pharmaceuticals gleamed with morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Lake Michigan. The mahogany table that had once hosted the Whitfield family's arrogant proclamations now served a very different purpose, surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds in medical research rather than entitled heirs trading on inherited wealth. At the head of the table sat Zara Washington. She had reclaimed her maiden name along with her power, her presence commanding the room not through intimidation or inherited privilege, but through the quiet authority that came from genuine expertise and hard-earned respect. The transformation had been swift and merciless. Within weeks of her revelation, the Whitfield family's carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. Marcus had been forced to declare personal bankruptcy when his assets were revealed to be nothing more than loans secured against company stock he didn't actually own. Helena's medical license had been suspended pending investigation into her role in falsifying clinical trial data, her reputation destroyed by evidence that Zara had been collecting for years. Victoria's husband faced federal charges for medical device fraud, while Victoria herself had been reduced to working as a pharmaceutical sales representative for a company that wouldn't even return her calls 6 months earlier. But perhaps the most poetic justice had been reserved for Sophia Chen, whose betrayal at the dinner party had cost her everything she had worked to build. Her biotech startup had collapsed when funding mysteriously evaporated. Her research partnerships had been terminated without explanation, and her professional reputation had been quietly destroyed through a whisper campaign that painted her as unreliable and ethically compromised. She now worked as a lab technician at a community college, her Harvard MBA and years of experience reduced to nothing more than expensive pieces of paper that no one in the industry would honor. The quarterly results are extraordinary, announced Dr. Sarah Kim, Genesis Pharmaceuticals' new chief scientific officer, as she presented data that would have been impossible under the Whitfield family's profit-driven leadership. Our orphan drug program has brought 12 new treatments to market. Our gene therapy research has produced breakthrough results for 3 previously incurable genetic disorders. and our partnership with international humanitarian organizations has provided life-saving medications to over 2 million patients in developing countries. Zara nodded approvingly as she reviewed the reports that proved what she had always known, that pharmaceutical companies could be both profitable and ethical, that scientific research could serve humanity rather than just shareholders, that medicine could be a force for healing rather than exploitation. Under her leadership, Genesis Pharmaceuticals had become the industry standard for responsible drug development, attracting the world's top researchers and generating profits that dwarfed anything the Whitfield family had ever achieved. There's something else, Dr. Kim continued, her voice carrying a note of excitement that made everyone in the room lean forward. The Alzheimer's treatment we've been developing, the one that Marcus Whitfield wanted to abandon because the market was too small, has just received FDA approval for human trials. If successful, it could reverse cognitive decline in early-stage patients. The irony was exquisite. The research that Marcus had dismissed as unprofitable was now poised to become one of the most significant medical breakthroughs of the century, potentially saving millions of families from the heartbreak of watching their loved ones disappear into the fog of dementia. Zara thought of her own grandmother, who had died of Alzheimer's while Zara was still in college, and felt a deep satisfaction that transcended any personal revenge. The meeting concluded with discussions of new research initiatives, international expansion plans, and charitable programs that would bring cutting-edge treatments to underserved communities around the world. As the board members filed out, chatting excitedly about projects that would have been impossible under the old regime, Zara remained seated at the head of the table, savoring the quiet satisfaction of a vision finally realized. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Zara smiled as she read the sender's name, David Chun, who had become not just her business partner but one of her closest friends in the aftermath of his sister's betrayal. Turn on Channel 7. The message read, "You'll want to see this." Zara activated the wall-mounted television and found herself watching a news report about Marcus Whitfield's latest humiliation. The man who had once commanded respect in Chicago's pharmaceutical circles was now standing outside a bankruptcy court, his expensive suit replaced by an ill-fitting outfit from a discount store, his arrogant demeanor replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who had lost everything and couldn't understand how it had happened. "Mr. Whitfield," a reporter called out, "do you have any comment on the allegations that your family's pharmaceutical empire was built on fraudulent research and illegal business practices?" Marcus looked directly into the camera, and for a moment Zara saw a flicker of the man who had spat in her face 6 months earlier. But the arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition, the dawning awareness that he had been playing a game whose rules he had never understood, against an opponent whose capabilities he had never bothered to assess. "I have no comment," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible above the noise of traffic and shouting reporters, "except to say that sometimes the people you think you know best are the ones you don't know at all." The news report cut to footage of Helena Whitfield being escorted from her medical practice by federal agents, her silver hair disheveled, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The woman who had spent decades building her reputation as a leading pharmaceutical researcher was now facing criminal charges that would likely result in prison time, her legacy destroyed by the same evidence-gathering skills she had once used to advance her career. Zara turned off the television and walked to the window, looking out over the city that had once seemed so hostile, so determined to keep her in her place. Chicago's skyline stretched before her, its towers reaching toward a sky that no longer seemed like a ceiling but like an infinite expanse of possibility. She thought about the dinner party that had started it all, about the moment when Marcus's cruelty had finally pushed her past the point of silent endurance. The woman who had sat quietly at that table, absorbing insults and betrayals while planning her response, was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that true power didn't come from inherited wealth or social connections, but from the courage to use your abilities in service of something larger than yourself. The pharmaceutical empire she had built wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving that business could be a force for good, that success could be measured in lives saved rather than profits maximized. Her phone rang, and Zara smiled as she saw the caller ID. Dr. Maria Santos, the director of a children's hospital in Guatemala where Genesis Pharmaceuticals had just opened a free clinic providing genetic therapy treatments to families who could never have afforded them otherwise. "Zara," Dr. Santos said, her voice thick with emotion, I wanted you to know that little Carlos, the boy with sickle cell disease, he's responding beautifully to the treatment. His parents are crying with joy. They never thought they'd see their son run and play like other children. Zara felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to the story of a life transformed, a family given hope, a future made possible by the decision to use science for healing rather than profit. This was what real power looked like, not the ability to humiliate others, but the capacity to lift them up. Not the privilege to take whatever you wanted, but the responsibility to give whatever you could. Thank you for calling, Maria, Zara said softly. Give Carlos and his family my love, and remind them that they're not alone. There are people all over the world working to make sure that every child has the chance to live a healthy, happy life. As she ended the call, Zara thought about the dinner party one more time, about the moment when Marcus had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a racial stereotype, a powerless victim of his casual cruelty. He had been wrong about so many things, but perhaps most fundamentally, he had been wrong about the nature of power itself. He had confused dominance with leadership, cruelty with strength, inherited privilege with earned authority. The woman he had tried to break had instead broken free, not just from his abuse but from the entire system that had enabled it. She had built something better, something that proved that success didn't require stepping on others, that power could be used to heal rather than harm, that the most profound victories came not from destroying your enemies but from making their cruelty irrelevant. Zara Washington stood at the window of her corner office, looking out over a city that now knew her name not as the victim of a public humiliation, but as the visionary leader who had revolutionized an entire industry. The empire she had built would outlast any personal revenge, would continue saving lives long after the people who had wronged her were forgotten. And perhaps that was the most perfect justice of all. Not just proving them wrong, but making their wrongness irrelevant to the larger story of what she had chosen to build with her life. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Zara of the fire that had burned in her chest during those dark months when she had planned her response to their cruelty. But the fire had transformed into something else now. Not the destructive flame of revenge, but the steady light of purpose, illuminating a path forward that would benefit millions of people who would never know her name, but whose lives would be touched by her work. If this story has reminded you that true power lies not in tearing others down but in building something meaningful that lifts everyone up, share it with someone who needs to believe that dignity can never truly be stolen and that the quietest people often carry the loudest thunder. Subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that prove that the most profound victories come not from destroying our enemies, but from making their cruelty irrelevant to the larger story of what we choose to build with our lives.